Hey there guys, it's Metro. If you're meeting me for the first time, welcome. I've been playing World of Warcraft since the day it came out, and I've played through every single patch the game has ever had, alongside leading a progression raiding guild from the beginning of Wrath of the Lich King into this very day in World of Warcraft Legion. When Classic itself was out properly, I was very young. I played sports in high school and was in a very toxic relationship with my first real girlfriend, and these experiences led me to play WoW sporadically, but when I could, I savored every single minute. I played a dwarf warrior named Blackhammer on the server Silverhand with a relatively casual guild called Phoenix Rising, but the leadership was in league with a much larger, more serious guild that would organize cross-guild progression raiding. I ran Molten Core and Zul'Gurub a few times until the AQ War events opened, which was right around the time the basketball season opened. Because of this, I was unable to raid with them, but then I returned after the season was over, and they were in Nax. And I cleared up to 4 horsemen 3 times with them as they were progressing on it and needed an extra tank. We killed the boss on the 3rd reset, and I was never asked to come again. You see, this is what Classic really is. Fond memories. I'm making this video because it seems many people don't understand what Classic actually is, or what they should expect when playing it. I see people all around the internet very excited that Classic WoW was announced, but some are being overly protective of their victory. There are people who will never enjoy Classic, or perhaps are just immature and jealous everyone is so excited, and are trying to dampen the parade a bit. In return, those who were excited for Classic are seemingly making things up about what Classic really is to bolster their position. So today I will be dispelling the rumors about some key features of Classic and answering any questions to the best of my ability in the comment section. As a disclaimer, this video is based mostly on 5+ years of private servers where I've leveled 10+ toons to 60, 5 of which were on the Miscellaneous realm that eventually became Anathema in the Elysium/Light's Hope cluster. Because of this, my knowledge is primarily focused on the 1.12 patch that private servers were forced upon. Blizzard does not use this finite patch system, which I expect they may look to avoid, then some of this may be slightly inaccurate, but will likely still apply in some way. Let's begin. We'll start with leveling and questing. Many people, both who have played private servers and who have not, think leveling in Classic is this magical, splendid, perfect system that has Dark Souls level challenge awaiting at it at every turn and is deeply immersive. They often use this as a counter to live leveling, which has become an utter afterthought after dozens of nerfs and the strength of heirlooms. The truth about leveling in Classic is somewhere in between, in fact. The first thing you need to realize is that there are no quest marking or indications on either the map or the minimap. You cannot look at either map to figure out where to pick up quests. Even when you are able to turn them in, there's only a single dot on the minimap, not the standard exclamation part and question marks that we've come to learn which came in TBC. People will tell you this is part of the splendor, and maybe it was in 2004, but many private server players have resorted to an add-on called Questy, which was developed specifically and heavily for the Miscellaneous project and other private servers in the modern day, and shows all the modern quest information like Quest Helper or other add-ons like that might have done. In terms of actually leveling via questing, it is very inefficient, even if you know exactly where everything is. Questing from 1 to 40 something is very inefficient for these following reasons. Number 1, almost all of the quests revolve around you traveling very far away from where you pick them up. Anytime when you are running, you are not gaining experience. Number 2, many of the quests request that you fight mobs that will have actual abilities and will be in high density areas, resulting in a lot more danger than elsewhere. This danger comes in the form of the mob you are fighting fleeing into other mobs, a thing that all humanoids can do in Classic and will do under 20%, unlike modern WoW. Unless the leadership of the server takes action to solve this, number 3 will be that there will always be extreme competition for certain quests. Sometimes because there are loot quests with bad respawns or drops, or sometimes because there are only 5 mobs in an area when you need 12. There's no shared tag system in Classic, as this came in MoB. For reference, when Elysium launched, it had over 10,000 people, and they all started at level 1, meaning roughly 1,000+ players in each questing area. For these reasons, I would heavily recommend grinding mobs in Classic instead of questing to level until you can get a mount at least. I grind exclusively from 1 to 40-ish, and the benefits are clear. You fight mobs that have no dangerous elements, meaning you will never die from PvE. You fight mobs that are not for any quests, so there will never be another reason for players to come around you typically, both in PvP and your faction. And there is no travel involved. You grind in a pattern that resets at some point, meaning you are constantly getting experience at a rate at which which you can kill them. As I see it, if you are leveling alone without some intense guide to follow, grinding 1 to whatever is the most consistent way to level and the way anyone serious about getting max level should consider doing. It entirely debunks the notion that leveling in Classic is difficult by any stretch of the imagination as well, but it is of course leading you to miss out on any story that would have came with those quests. Another key problem with questing is that the zones are not structured like they were from Wrath onwards. There are many quests in each zone that you cannot do at the level you may be at, and many zones that require you to go to other zones to continue quest lines. These travel quests are typically horribly inefficient but lead to a major story point, and this is one of the largest swing points on this mentality. Do you care about leveling efficiently or experiencing the full story? If you chose the latter, you thus abandon the right to claim of any difficulty. So the TLDR of leveling is people who think it's immersive, cohesive, and extremely challenging are simply inexperienced, aka noobs. If you're new to any game, it will be these things the first time through. But after leveling multiple characters to 60 in a single year, I can say comfortably that there is a little enjoyment about the 3 main flaws with questing, and absolutely no challenge whatsoever with my method of grinding, which I usually do mentally AFK while pressing 1 to 2 buttons while watching a series or film. Second thing we'll discuss today is leveling speeds and why. Many people note that leveling to 60 in Classic is a real journey and that compared to modern WoW is something memorable and altering. In this general assertion, I will agree wholeheartedly, but warn again against the inexperience we spoke about in the last section. The facts of the matter are that the average player with medium WoW experience will require 7 days of in-game playtime to get to 60. It usually takes this person about 3 days just to get to 40, which is when each class gets its first major talent point that usually turns their spec into something complete. My average playtime is around 6 days to 60, with grinding especially, and there are people who have done it in under 3 days thanks to heavy coordination or preparation. I find my grinding route and guides to be the perfect way for the average player to level, as it makes use of rested heavily and encourages you to play more than one character at a time and to live your real life. If you have no obligations and will be playing WoW 10 plus hours a day, grinding is not as profitable and may get overly boring. On the final tune I ended up leveling on Anathema, I was at 6 days and a few hours, with well over 5+ hours lost to ganking as I made the mistake of leveling my character while streaming. If that didn't happen, I would have been able to say for the first time I came in at a 5-day split, which would have been my own personal record despite never trying for any. There are many things that influence leveling speed, and it's best to think of it in 2 ways. How much damage can you consistently do, and how much downtime will there be? It is with these 2 things in mind that I've made a tier list on the easiest to level tunes, but the take-home message there is some characters do significantly less DPS while leveling, and ignoring downtime for now, this is for 2 reasons. While leveling, things like resistance as a spellcaster and miss, parry, dodge as a melee are very, very prevalent. Hit chance is one of the best DPS stats in the game, as well as spell power, and almost no gear you will find sub 50 will have any of it. You will be at the mercy of random rolls on every single global you do, and people say Legion has too much RNG. Another key problem is spell selection. In Classic, the specs and classes are very imbalanced, and this is at 60. Most classes have a single ability that will constitute a majority of their globals, such as Frostbolt or Shadowbolt, and this stands out even more so while leveling. Key spells are likely hidden in talent trees or not unlockable until the mid-30s from a trainer for all classes. It is with this in mind that you should plan ahead which spells you do and do not buy. Don't forget, every 2 levels you can buy some new spells from your trainer, but most are completely useless while leveling, and even more useless while grinding. Another key issue is gear. Even if you quest, you will still get very little good gear. The best way I approach gear while grinding is to use any money I make, which will be discussed later, to buy upgrades every 4 or so levels. This will be discussed more in depth, but I will say it is incredibly important to get some decent gear early, and is likely a key reason why most people think leveling is difficult. Gear is horribly distributed in Classic and terribly itemized. Most pieces only have 2 primary stats and nothing more, especially while leveling. Knowing that, it's important to take into consideration downtime. Each class will have some type of downtime in between pulls no matter what. The ideal state would of course be 0 seconds, but achieving this will be likely meaning that you are fighting things that you are much higher level than, or that you have spent considerably time outgearing, thus potentially cutting off your efficiency, or it will mean you are playing a certain spec in class. Here's a brief example of the major downtime reasons while leveling, especially while grinding. Example number 1. A mage must cast spells to do a bulk of their damage, and these spells cost a non-trivial amount of mana, perhaps 10 casts per full mana bar. This means every 10 stacks you must drink, and drinking a full bar of mana likely takes 5 to 10 seconds. As a priest, however, your spells will do much less damage than a mage, but you have a key talent called Spirit Tap and Improved Wands, making your out-of-combat downtime significantly lessened. Wands cost no mana, and anytime you kill a mob, you will get a huge increase to your mana regeneration. The goal as a priest is to end up mana neutral, which will mean significantly more wanding and less casting, leading to significantly less DPS than a mage, but significantly less downtime than a mage. Example number 2. As a warrior, you are the quintessential struggle in Classic, but eventually you will do more damage than anyone. At say level 25, you will be clearing through mobs with ease, but will be taking damage, and you have zero way to heal yourself up. Victory Rush is not in Classic. This means you will be forced to eat anytime your health gets too low, and eating takes 5 to 10 seconds at least, just like drinking. So what if you use a sword and shield instead of a two-hander? You will deal significantly less damage, but will take much less damage, as everything we will grind does exclusively melee hits. This will mean almost no downtime comparatively, but will the DPS loss outweigh that? In Classic, there are only 3 classes per faction that have any type of casted heal, being Priest, Paladin, and Druid for Alliance, or Priest, Shaman, and Druid for Horde. We will ignore Priest as they are arranged, but the other 3 options are nearly exclusively best as melee. Example number 3. The 3 classes in question are notorious for their limited damage output, but they all have a heal. They all also have defensive talents and options, even Shaman. It is better to, say, build full ret as a Paladin with no interest in defense than heal yourself up a few times after combat. Perhaps it's better to build protection and spend no time out of combat, topping yourself up with a single heal, but dealing very little damage, assuming no reckoning and other shenanigans. When healing yourself, you must consider mana. For example, shifting into cat form does cost a good amount of mana. Then as example 4, we have hunters and warlocks, who have naturally tanky pets that will survive almost everything. They are the exception to what we've been talking about and will have almost no downtime and will be the fastest levelers because of it. But do you want to play these classes at 60 just because they level fast? The TLDR of leveling speed is that it is a very serious time commitment. Most people who play games in 2017 have short attention spans derived from there being a multitude of multitasking happening in games and from a love of multiple types of games playing them at once. If you level in Classic, there will be times where you have to grind, and you will need some degree of dedication and patience. I expect 90% of the player base who checks out Classic when it is announced will not make it to 60 because of this. There are simply no shortcuts to this, and it will be a true test of your determination, but should never challenge you, leading it to end in boredom or malaise. Without proper gearing, spell selection, and travel options, leveling is quite tedious and long in Classic. Next up, we'll discuss the gearing and reward systems of Classic. One of the most frustrating things I see people say when discussing Classic is that the reward systems, including gearing, are more substantial and powerful than at any other point in the game's life cycle. But I'll explain to you why this is actually quite the opposite in the year 2017 and onward. The first thing to realize about Classic is that the standard paradigm of quests into dungeons into raids still applies, but loot in all of them is very hit or miss. Let's take the dungeon Stratholme as an example. Examine Baron Rivendare's loot table. There are over 20 items on his loot table, and they will range heavily from completely useless to amazing. For example, he drops the dungeon set pants, which are mostly terrible for anyone not looking for something very specific to happen. That's 9 loot slots right there. Then he has the item Ritzin's Wand, which has 11 spell damage on it, which would be much less than a green BOE that you could purchase on the auction house, as well as the Dracorian Gauntlets, male hands with intellect, spirit, and stam on it, and nothing more. No matter how you slice it, these items are very underwhelming. They may be better than something you have if you are incredibly undergeared, but is very unlikely, as browsing the auction house can find you upgrades easily. Then there are the Robes of the Exalted, with 68 plus healing on it and some int and spirit. These are itemized so well that most healers will keep these until well into BWL, if not further. And the Scepter of Unholy, a mace with high amount of shadow damage on it, hugely coveted by an aspiring shadow priest. And of course, there is still the Epic Sword with no stats on it whatsoever other than movement speed and life regen. Oh yeah. With this boss, you see a snapshot of the problem. In Classic, there are some pieces that are incredibly strong and some that are utterly useless, all off the same boss. This is typically a result of them trying to rebalance stats in dungeon over time and eventually leading to 2 pieces off the same boss where one is worse than leveling greens and the other is better than molten core gear. This problem is even worse on a boss like the Unforgiven, a boss that you might do on the way to Rivendare, technically in the route to live side in Stratholme. The boss has 5 pieces of loot, and one of them is the Mask of the Unforgiven, a leather helm with 2% hit and 1% crit on it. Easily best in slot for any melee DPS. It also has a single piece of dungeon tier gloves on it, which being Druid, which are horrible for them, and plate shoulders with 14 stam, 14 strength, and 10 shadow resist. Ooh. So, with this example explained, you could easily see the real problem here compared to even the Burning Crusade. These bosses drop gear that can range from incredible to completely useless. It is not fun to kill a boss and see something drop that no one would ever want in the entire game, and it's also not fun to kill a boss when the only reason anyone is in the group is for the chance at the item you are looking for. For me, this makes gearing very formulaic, and I think you'll come to agree after having played for an extended period. Classic and private servers have been out so long that everyone knows your pre-raid best in slot gear down to the letter, and there are very little options in some slots. That helm discussed has one other option from BRD, and if you have neither, then you are wearing some random blue with just some main stat on it. This means you refer to a spreadsheet for every single item. Go search for groups with no competition on that item in them, and maybe even consider reserving the piece, as there is no personal loot or reasons you can't switch to Master Looter in a pug in Classic. This happens heavily on private servers and essentially shows just how little excitement there can be to get items. Another key problem is the lack of interest in dungeons outside of actual gear. Many people fondly remember dungeons in Classic as the proving grounds for aspiring players, but after you have the gear from them, there is again no reason to go back. This is a problem that is solved in later expansions, such as the Burning Crusade with the badge and daily heroic systems, one that would actually work well, very well indeed, in Classic. It is substantially buried by the challenge mode and Mythic Plus systems in MOP and onward, forever making dungeons not only heavily replayable, but incredibly competitive. In Classic, there are some minor reasons why you may want to return to dungeons like BOE patterns or the Alchemy Station in Skullmanch, which adds heavily to the RPG elements, but something a modern player used to Mythic Plus or even the badge system of TBC will immediately notice as a poorly derived incentive. Another time this rhetoric gets carried away is in raid gear. The same faults of dungeon gear apply to raids even further, as the boss requires 40 players but usually drops between 2 to 4 pieces, and of course some of which, especially in Molten Core, are completely useless for literally every spec. What people will say is that having gear from the later raids proves you are a cut above the normal player, and that you can distinguish these players simply by looking at them. This is true and unique to early expansions, but I fear too much of it comes from nostalgia, as getting this gear is no less luck-driven than anything else, and raiding is not some vaunted tower that must be climbed, as people seem to think. In reality, having a 955 piece off Mythic Kil'jaeden is far more prestigious and rewarding than anything in Classic, because it likely means that you've wiped hundreds of times and got extremely lucky. The TLDR of gearing is that many of the systems you may have grown used to about gearing in PvE are simply not applicable in Classic, as they do not exist. You will struggle mightily to find groups for things you may want because those bosses have no good loot on them other than the thing you are after. But there is nothing out there that is a secret anymore whatsoever. Everyone knows everything about what they want, and unless they tweak itemization for the official server, the same problems with reserving and selling tank runs will persist, leaving you yearning for a day where no master loot options are available in 5-man pugs, or for the daily dungeon system to get more people playing. Overall, medium quality gear takes much more time to acquire than it does in, say, Legion, but getting the best gear in both games is equally prestigious. In the modern game, gear floods the streets, which can lead to some confusion about what should be really important about gearing. That is, chasing the best gear possible, not just some random piece that you could acquire with no effort. After all, you wouldn't settle for those plate shoulders from Unforgiven in Classic, so why would you settle for a 915 in Legion? Next on the topic list is the difficulty of endgame PvE. This is probably the number one thing I hear people talk about, and one that really needs to be properly understood before you decide if you want to play Classic seriously and potentially for years to come. No matter how you slice it, the hardest content any expansion will offer will challenge you. But the way challenge comes in Classic is far different than any other expansion in World of Warcraft. For example, a mythic boss in Legion may ask you to be dealing with dozens of mechanics over a 6-minute encounter. You may have to move a ton while maintaining your DPS, and you will very likely have to stand in something on purpose to survive it, so the rest of your raid does not die. Typically, at least in Tomb, a single mistake cascades into a full wipe in Mythic because of how the mechanics interact with each other, but also because of enrage and DPS requirements. In Classic, everything's entirely different. There are 2 separate types of PvE difficulty that are commonly discussed, but let's start with dungeons for simplicity's sake. Now, objectively, dungeons in Legion are infinitely more difficult, but that is simply because of the Mythic Plus system. In Classic, there is of course only one difficulty, and it never changes or gets harder. There isn't even the heroic difficulty that you might have come to know, which is introduced in the Burning Crusade. The dungeons often are large, sprawling areas, and for the case of BRD, laid out like an actual city, with 2 to 3 options as to how you might progress through them. This alone might be seen as the first challenge of Classic, but certainly adds to the RPG elements of Classic that I've grown to love. Knowing where to go and how to go is just as important as it might be in a Mythic Plus, but there will also be multiple mob types in some dungeons that will heavily challenge you if you aren't overgearing them. However, once you are familiar with the routes and layouts, you'll then come to realize the real challenge of the dungeon is that some specs and abilities are naturally much stronger in Classic than other expansions. There'll be many packs where you simply cannot survive the damage from them all, and this happens quite often with packs that involve casters. As there's very poor native support for cast bars and interrupts in Classic, and there's absolutely zero magic mitigation outside of wearing resistance gear, you'll likely find some packs to be overly dangerous without multiple CC uses. The first true challenge of Classic dungeons is just that, preparing for the pull and not actually dealing with the pull once you engage it. This is of course much the opposite of modern WoW, but equally challenging. Problem is, if you don't have a mage for sheep or a priest for shackle, sometimes you simply cannot CC the mobs you'd like to CC. This further creates the hierarchy where mages are gods, warlocks and rogues are great, and anything not a hunter or a priest are useless in 5-mans. This leads us to the second true challenge of Classic dungeons, class imbalance. The main culprit of this for the longest time was tanking. In Classic, warriors are heavily favored as the only tank option, and at one point in the game's history, many people felt this was law. In modern WoW, Guardian Druid was de facto best tank, and many guilds relied on them heavily to clear the hardest content, but it was never impossible to have the other tanks come as some may have suggested it was in Classic. At least on private servers, new research has come out proving paladins especially, but druids also can benefit heavily from specific pieces of gear and stats and make them into viable tank options, especially for dungeons. The biggest issue in dungeons for the tank is not staying alive like it might be in Legion, but actually keeping threat. Most mobs in Classic dungeons will die in 3 to 4 globals, but they will also kill the damage dealers that quickly if allowed to, so before they can attempt to attack them, the tank must have aggro. This is a marquee issue with many people, remembering to the point of difficulty of Classic, but like so many others, it is again bred from raw inexperience. In truth, Paladin and Druid are extremely capable 5-man tanks, and despite the fact that they are even better at healing does not make them useless as such. The key problem with Paladin is that it lacks a definitive taunt or any defensive CDs, but if you follow modern wisdom about the class, you will come to find that threat becomes a non-factor for Paladins under the right conditions, leaving the only gap being survival, which can also be offset to some degree. We'll talk about class balance more shortly, but for now let's talk about raid difficulty. Many of what we spoke about still applies here, especially on trash, but things can change heavily on bosses. Again, the threat model is a main limiting factor, and pulling threat on a boss is certain wipe, as many bosses are taunt immune and position required. As an aside, taunt also requires melee range, so a warrior chasing a lava giant around can be quite funny, especially if they are a gnome. Many people say Classic raids are incredibly difficult and required far more effort than any other expansion set's raids, but it's important to realize where the difficulty might come from. When we talk about difficulty elsewhere in Classic, a catch-all phrase to describe it easily can be, it's not actually hard, but just time-consuming. This applies most squarely to raids in my opinion, especially the early raids, but even into Nax. One of the biggest problems with how Classic operates is your character, as he stands alone, is entirely weak. The gear you wear can be a limiting factor for this, as itemization problems persist through BWL, but once you realize how many consumables and outside buffs there are out in the world, you quickly realize what Classic raiding is all about. Now, I actually love this idea, where you can heavily help your character get sizably stronger outside raid to make your raid time that much easier. This is a principle that has made Legion so fun for me, as it very much applies there too, especially early in the expansion. In fact, old warp potions were so hard to come by and so expensive in the first weeks of Legion that it felt like they really wanted Classic back. Focusing all your attention on consumables in Classic means you have a lot of work ahead of you though. If you spend 8 hours a week raiding and want full consumables for every single pull, you will need to do probably at least 8 hours a week preparing, if not closer to 16. The problem is supply, but also economy. At least on private servers, many people treat the limited supply of some materials as a chance to create a monopoly, and this led to some pretty strange interactions like cross-faction collusion or spawn camping herbs with dozens of characters. Regardless, the same issue can be translated to anything you might find difficult about raiding. When you have 40 people and you always spawn at the entrance, wipe recovery is usually longer than the actual pull. This leads to using wipe prevention like Soulstone to make sure healers can begin the rezzing process, and typically leads to 5 to 10 minutes of prep in between each wipe, whereas in Legion you essentially release, eat, and pull within 2 minutes. However, in Classic, many bosses are very forgiving, most notably allowing for guilds to farm with less than a full raid, thanks in no small part to imbalance created by 40 player requirements. This is especially true in Molten Core, and a lot of this deals with the fact that at one point 1.12 contains balance and talents that trivialize it, but many bosses have only a single mechanic to ever worry about, typically a dispel or a position displacement. Mechanics in Classic can easily be described as a team effort instead of an individual effort. For example, a mythic encounter in Legion can be described by saying if a player makes a single mistake, he will likely wipe the entire raid every single time, whereas in Classic, you can have 20 players die and still comfortably handle most mechanics happening. Part of the issue is again class balance, as for example, Horde is significantly hindered in PvE compared to Alliance. Alliance having Paladins give them Blessing of Salvation, and Threat is usually the biggest reason for DPS output, as many specs can do considerably more damage than Threat might allow. Paladins also can give physical immunity, mana regeneration, and can dispel magic, where the only other option for dispelling magic would be Priests. Shamans bring more aggressive solutions to some problems like Wind Fury Totem, Resistance Totems, and Chain Heal, but leave a lot to be desired, especially in the early raids. The TLDR of the system is that if everyone had full consumables for everything, like they would in Legion, the raids would be a complete joke all the time. Many of the raid releases on private servers claim to be very well scripted, yet guilds still kill them in one lockout, including Nax, with these world consumables disabled. Classic Challenge may have been there in 2005, but now that everyone has figured out all the secrets, you should not expect years of progression. The real challenge of PvE in Classic all around is preparation, and making up for the lack of class balance totally. Mechanics themselves will rarely test your ability to play your character, but killing the boss will require far more coordination of 40 players than most modern raiding would. The biggest difficulty will be whether you can keep 40 human beings attentive and prepared for a full night of raiding, instead of fighting DPS requirements or people failing to soak mechanics. I've been going with this phrase for a while, but I think it really applies here. Classic difficulty is like trying to cut a plank of wood with a wrench, while Legion difficulty is like trying to build an entire house with every tool available. Each will be difficult, but for very different reasons. Next up on the list is class balance. Class balance used to be a pretty easy discussion to have in Classic, as most people felt like it was pretty set in stone. Some specs like Mage and Warlock were much greater than Hunter and Shadow Priest, and some specs like Ret Paladin and Feral Druid were simply unplayably bad. But with the resurgence of private servers having thousands of active players, many people have found ways to truly push the limits of the game. Ret Paladin is a great example, as comparing it to even its TBC counterpart is laughable. The spec has literally no damaging ability, like Crusader Strike or Divine Storm, and relies on auto attacks, judgment, and the occasional undead damage plus consecrate. The problem with Ret is simply how imbalanced it actually is, and they have a few strong tools that no other melee have access to. They are the only melee with a potential AoE, they benefit heavily from spell power and other odd stats that don't affect melee typically, and they have immunities allowing them to approach situations very differently. A Ret Paladin seeking full spell power consumables and properly prepared can actually easily out DPS others, but when comparing the spec to another without these types of efforts, you will quickly see how clunky and poor its damage can be. This is the same for essentially any situation, and I'd expect there are people playing every spec in the game to a high level despite these stigma. This can be viewed as one of the richest parts of the vanilla experience because it encourages players to really care about their character and forces them to work hard to be the best it can be. However, there are still plenty of reasons to be dissatisfied with class balance, especially when you examine healers. A brief comparison of just the spell breakdown of healers will reveal something rather unfortunate. Because of how down-ranking works, healers like a Paladin or Druid suffer incredibly dull playstyles. They are essentially resigned to using a single spell with multiple ranks for 90% of their globals in combat. They are most useful for the buffs they might bring instead of actual throughput, such as blessings and battle res. Then compare them to a priest who has 10 plus healing spells that all need to be used properly, essentially unchanged from how they might play in modern expansions. Examining this clearly indicates a lack of insight into how to properly create multiple classes in competition with each other, but that's no surprise given what happens in Classic. What's also worth noting is that specs themselves are often incredibly imbalanced. If you play any of the pure DPS classes, you typically only have one spec option. Examine Mage for a clearer picture. Mages have 3 specs: Frost, Fire, and Arcane, exactly as it is in Legion. The Fire spec is among the best DPS specs in the entire game, and with high gear you will find Fire to be truly overpowered, but in the first 2 raids, all bosses have a passive fire resistance or flat-out immunity, meaning you will deal significantly less if not zero damage to them as a fire mage, making your core spells unusable. Frost, on the other hand, suffers very little from resistance and is the king of AoE and control. If you play a Frost mage, you can literally break the game. Think about what I do on my Blood Death Knight in Legion and expect to do similar things in Classic. Then there is Arcane, a spec with essentially one damaging ability unique to it, as Arcane Blast and Arcane Arcane Barrage do not exist until TBC and Wrath. The talent tree has a high amount of buff-type talents though, including Presence of Mind and Arcane Power. This leaves us with an illustration of what classic specs are really about. They are not carved playstyles like in the modern expansions. In reality, the highest DPS spec will likely be putting a lot of points into Arcane, and then the rest into another tree, but you will never actually deal Arcane damage. The buff tree is relatively common, and Priest is another example of where it's used heavily. Discipline is not what you'd expect it to be from Wrath and onward. The talents in the tree are mostly just ways to elevate your use of normal spells or affect PvP in some way. It doesn't in any way change the way you would heal, and you would effectively play as a Holy Priest would play today. Another peculiar part of life as a healer is that the classes with healing specs are the only ones with reses, but Druid only has battle res. They have no way to res more than one target more than once every 30 minutes, so if you bring a Druid healer with no other Priest, Shaman, or Paladin, you'll be waiting a very long time after any death in a 5-man. So the TLDR here is that balance essentially does not exist thanks to the amount of consumables and buffs available. Some specs have huge flaws, making them very, very difficult to play at a high level, but with all the buffs available, you can essentially triple your player power with them, if not more. An unprepared Bombkin or Rep Paladin will be one of the worst DPS you could ever bring in Classic, but if they put in a ton of effort and preparation, they can actually be better than the specs most people assume to be the top. You should not be discouraged to play what you like in Classic, but realize the spec you may like in Legion may literally not exist as is in Classic, especially if you intend to play a pure DPS or are considering tanking and healing. Things are very basic and often revolve around very few spells, but managing spell ranks and potions which have no in-combat CD, like in Legion, being the bulk of your key presses. Next topic up is the world and travel, and this is the number one thing I see players new to Classic discuss, and likely will be one thing that has the highest impact on you as a player no matter which content type you choose to pursue. The basics are as following. You cannot get any mount whatsoever until you are level 40. The mount and riding together will cost you about 100 gold depending on your reputation, which will not be easy to get. If you are a paladin or a warlock, you will get a spell that summons a mount, essentially for free at level 40. You do not get riding though, so if you wish to buy an epic mount and riding later, you will still need to do so. These mounts run 60% speed and take multiple seconds to cast to begin riding, and are stored in your bags. Because of this, it is unlikely that you will ride your mount between mobs like the way you may do in Wrath or onwards. You will now only mount to travel long distances. At level 60, you can buy an epic mount that will run 100% faster. This is the speed most people are used to on the ground. The mount and riding will cost considerably more money than you have. Good luck. Getting an epic mount in Classic is typically seen as the first major hurdle towards playing the game seriously, but I have played on multiple 60s to varying success and only ever owned an epic mount on one of them. I feel riding faster is not something that heavily affects your ability to play the game, but realize that a majority of what you do in Classic will involve travel of some kind, so you may disagree. When you start a character, you will have no flight paths whatsoever. There's an intro quest to give you a flight path from your level 10 hub to your city, but that's it. If you want to go to a different zone, you must walk. This can be very perilous and often leads to dozens of deaths along the way, especially for night elves looking to get to human zones. The flight paths must connect one by one, so if you're missing one in certain zones, you cannot traverse the entire continent. Flight paths also take considerably longer than in modern WoW, and a trip from the top to the bottom of one continent usually takes 10 plus minutes. The connected flight path system that allows you to fly from the top of the map to the bottom of the map also was not added until much later into Classic, so who knows if that's actually going to be the way it is on the official Blizzard servers. There are no flying mounts, obviously. They were introduced in the Burning Crusade and only became usable in Azeroth during Cataclysm. Graveyards are also severely limited in Classic, and on many private servers there were bugs with where you would spawn with relativeness to the graveyard, sometimes leaving you at a graveyard from a different zone just because it was the closest one to your actual location. There is usually 1 or 2 graveyards max in an entire zone, and this means if you die, you will have multiple minutes of running to be alive again. This can also be a good thing, though, if you plan it right. You can die on purpose with no gear on to get a free portal halfway across the zone, and res sickness will be offset by the length of travel to your next location. This will be particularly frustrating in raids, as some of the graveyards are incredibly far away. DWL is famous for this, as the graveyard is outside the mountain near the Horde questing area and Burning Steps, meaning you have have to run through the entire zone, then all the way up the mountain and chain to the orb to get back in. Only night elves move faster than normal speed when dead, and you will never get any type of mount or speed buff while dead. Final most confounding part about world travel is that there is no summoning stones in Classic. In the ZG patch, they introduced meeting stones, which allowed you to enter a menu where people who wanted to do a dungeon would discuss their needs and served as a point of meetup before entering the dungeon and its outside elements. They did not become stones that you could summon your friends with until the Burning Crusade, and it is likely to be the most annoying part of Classic for many players who are new to it. Warlocks can summon, but there are heavy restrictions. They require soul shards, a warlock-specific resource that they must acquire from dying mobs. Every summon requires one, meaning if you expect one warlock to summon an entire raid group, you are dreaming. If they are in a dungeon, they cannot summon people outside the dungeon to them. They can fully summon once they and their summoning target are in the same instance without restriction. You must not expect to summon in Classic. If you wish to join a raid or dungeon group already in progress, expect to travel or be outside before you begin searching. The fact that warlocks get a free mount with an amazing story-driven epic mount and can summon people to their location makes it a very desirable target for those on the fence about what to play in Classic. The TLDR on travel is that it takes a very long time, and if you're going to play Classic, you need to realize that. Travel will be a massive reason why leveling and raiding alike take longer than modern WoW and act as a very artificial way to increase the time needed to play the game. This can be very frustrating for anyone looking to play the game seriously who also has real-life commitments. For example, if raid starts at 7 and you log on right at 7, you will need at least 15 plus minutes to actually get to the raid. You must budget your time around this if you wish to raid, and if they have started, you cannot be summoned to them in the middle of the raid unless you are already actually inside the dungeon. Many people look at this as a core RPG element of the game that is missing in modern WoW, and I can agree with that. But also remind people that this is one of the main reasons that Classic is so casually approached by many, and ultimately kills a lot of forms of competition. In the end, you will find that the Classic world feels much more like a real world, and hopefully that will be a good thing for you. And finally, the last thing we're going to discuss is kind of a catch-all topic, being other tech and systems not mentioned. It's important to remember just how old this product actually is. The game was made in 2004, but was developed even earlier, and at the time, the client's resolution options were very limited, as well as UI options. With private server fame, many new add-ons and resources have come out that can be used to make the game experience very comfortable for a 2017 gamer, but there are still, of course, native restrictions. However, there are things that involve in the game's tech that simply do not exist, and among them are features for which people will struggle to live without. And I'm not talking about just gameplay things. Number one is auto loot. This is the most noticeable thing in Classic that should be a very basic feature of any MMO with this much looting in it. In order to loot, you have to click on the item you want in the loot window or hold the shift button when you go to click. I've found it easier to download the X-Loot add-on and use their feature to bring up the window at your mouse cursor and then just click to get through the loot, as holding shift every time becomes very cumbersome and leads to a very bad habit that is hard to break in modern WoW. Guild banks are another major issue for me, as storage in general is quite limited, and the transparency guild banks allow help the membership from feeling ripped off by the leadership, something far more likely to happen in a 40-man raid team than might happen in Legion. Mail, along with much longer delivery times, is also limited to one item per mail. Another quirk is that this type of window, such as mail or trade, does not take precedent on your screen like it does in ladder expansions. For example, if you have the trade or mail window open in Legion and you right-click an item in your bags, the item goes straight into the window. This will not happen in Classic, and if you're trying to send potions or consumables to an alt, you may end up consuming one of them by trying to trade it. By default, you cannot see the vendor costs of items, especially quest rewards, but there are many add-ons that will help with that. Things like cast bars and actual mob health numbers also don't exist in Classic, and without add-ons, you will be left entirely in the dark. You cannot speak to NPCs as a cat or in other shapeshift forms, and you cannot mount up while in those forms either. There's also no auto dismount, meaning you need to press multiple buttons to do these actions, but again, there is an add-on for this. Dungeons and raids did not have maps associated with them at all. Some add-ons have created composites based on an overhead view, however. The talent system can have its own 40-minute video, but just realize that there is no dual specialization, no free respecs, and the price required goes up steadily until it hits 50 gold. This I see as one of the biggest flaws with Classic and discourages encourages character customization heavily, but luckily talents are not as important in Classic as they might be in TBC and onward, so you can easily heal with feral talents, etc. Hunters use mana, require ammo to shoot their weapons, and must keep their pet well fed and happy for it to perform and stay with you, meaning it's possible to have a lot of issues managing a pet and ammo in raids. Pets also do not have the AoE protection in Classic and will die quite a lot, often causing some hunters to just play without one in raids. Enhanced versions of buffs and spells typically require reagents, meaning if you run out, you can no longer use the spell. The TLDR here is, if you remember something inconvenient about the game at some point, it is very likely in there in Classic. Purists look at this as part of the package, but a 2017 gamer might expect at least some changes to come to some of these. Regardless of what ends up happening, playing Classic will give any modern gamer a breath of fresh air into how gaming used to be, and also a healthy appreciation for some of the tech delivered in today's market. So, these are the facts about Classic, or as near to objectivity as I can imagine anyone coming. I'm making this video because I love both Classic and Modern WoW, and would very much like to see the communities coexist. Every time I see someone fabricate something about either game, I feel it degrades the respect of the entire community. And now that Blizzard has officially announced support, it's important that we all get along. If you are excited about the new expansion, or the release of Classic, then please do everyone a favor, and don't try to convince other people that they shouldn't be. Comparing the vanilla product to a modern product is frankly idiotic, as almost nothing is the same. However, there are some glaring flaws with Classic that no one should be denying. Try to recognize these facts and do not try to embellish the flaws as something that Blizzard has intentionally created. Many things, especially technology-based, were simply not available to be added to the game, and as you can see with the Burning Crusade, they clearly were happy to do so when it becomes possible. There are many more topics that I could discuss, but the video is already too long as it is. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and I will do my best to answer them in the comment section below. I am very passionate about World of Warcraft, and I want people to approach all versions of it with an open mind. If you are interested in making the announcement of Classic the best decision Blizzard has ever made, we need the private server community to abandon the memes, the aggression, and the hype mongering, and integrate properly into the modern WoW community. I fear that if we fail to make this integration, the bickering will never stop, and as it was on private servers, a serious majority of the population will not make it to max level or ever be interested in playing the game for years instead of just months. The way I see it, this works best if everyone is dedicated to the game rather than the idea of it. Anyway, thanks for watching. Feel free to post any questions you have about this topic, and I look forward to answering them all. See you guys in the next one.